Welcome to the second portion of my talk. And in this part, I will be talking about computational syntax using HPSG, the HPSG formalism. In the previous portion, I already showed you the slide where I summarized how computational syntax is this field where we implement grammars on the computer and then run those grammars on sentences automatically. And as we grow those grammars in line with the Montagu's method of fragments philosophy, we accumulate these knowledge artifacts that the grammars represent. And as such, we also grow the area of applicability of the hypotheses, the syntactic hypotheses which grammars represent. But what is a grammar? What do I mean when I use this term? So one definition that comes to mind in the classic natural language processing context is a grammar is a set of rules which can be taken in by a parser to parse and generate sentences. The definition that I mean is pretty similar to that. A grammar is a set of rules which can be loaded into a parser to parse and generate sentences, but such that it gives some kind of insight into language, human language faculties. I am actually working somewhere in between these two definitions. So I am concerned with insight into human linguistic faculties, but I'm also concerned with being able to do natural language processing and to actually apply syntactic theory in practice, which limits to a certain degree sort of the amount of philosophical theorizing that you might engage in when you do syntax. Why on earth did I come here today to talk to natural language processing crowd about grammars? Because grammars aren't used very much in contemporary NLP. This spider web here is supposed to represent neural networks, which is something that is widely used. However, I want to argue that grammars actually are implicitly used by natural language processing today and are used all the time. It's just that we don't always think about it. Evaluation relies on annotation of some sort. Annotation, in turn, usually relies on some kind of systematized knowledge, one way or the other. You need to be able to reason about what you see in a human reasoning type of way. Grammars are one of the kinds of such systematized knowledge, and even something like the Pentry Bank or the Universal Dependencies project, they aren't grammars in the same sense that that I use the term for in terms of the amount of insight that I believe these frameworks are capable of giving us into human language faculties. But they are grammars in the sense that somebody had to, at some point, sit down and systematize that annotation scheme and formalize it and produce some kind of annotation guidelines. So any annotation guidelines are a grammar. Now, doing that, producing annotation of this sort by hand is hard to do. Humans are inconsistent, they make mistakes, and after we are done, it becomes hard to update and improve the annotation in a systematic way. And so in general, this approach doesn't really scale unless you use an implemented grammar of the sort that I am talking about here. So an implemented grammar, which is rooted in linguistic knowledge, which you can deploy on data to produce annotations of this sort, for example. So my goal is to be able to do that for more languages, for more diverse, typologically diverse languages in a systematic and easily updatable way, which is to say in an automatic way. And in this way, my goal is to rely on indispensable human knowledge and preserve it, but support it with computational means. Compared to pen and paper syntax, so pen and paper syntax, classic sort of old traditional understanding of what syntacticians do, is one will start with considering a few sentences and then hypothesize an analysis, a syntactic analysis for those sentences. So what kind of syntactic structure corresponds to this kind of sentence? And how does it generalize, and what kind of insight does it give me regarding the syntax of human language in general? And then the pen and paper thing, so you either try to test it in your head or with literally with pen and paper. And if you notice any kind of problem, such as the grammar fragment that you are envisioning overgenerates or fails to generate a particular grammatical sentence, then you try to revise your hypothesis. So that's what I call pen and paper or traditional syntax. Computational syntax, you start very much the same. You also usually start from a particular phenomenon that is of interest to you, and you hypothesize an analysis within a certain syntactic framework. But then you implement the analysis on the computer, and then crucially, you can test on as many sentences as you like. And the analyses of different phenomena can be in literal interaction with one another, right? Unlike in pen and paper, when you have to hypothesize an analysis for, let's say, how tense works in a language, and then you need to not forget about what your ideas are about how, for example, person system works in this language, but you somehow need to make sure when you are testing in your head or with pen and paper, you need to somehow make sure that you are not forgetting any single detail of all those analyses, and that's hard. So in computational syntax, we similarly revise hypotheses when we encounter problems, but we hopefully do all of this in a slightly more systematic manner. To summarize, my goal is to make implemented linguistic grammars bigger and more accessible to a broader research community. Rather, not to summarize, but kind of to give you a preview of what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes in the remaining part of this portion of my talk. So I want to make implemented grammars more accessible to a broader research community. And my particular method of doing that is what I call meta grammar engineering with head-driven phrase structure grammar. And I will explain to you what these things are in this and in the next portion of my talk. A specific project that I am talking about today has to do with an HPSG head-driven phrase structure grammar analysis of constituent questions. Constituent questions are, you may be familiar with the term WH questions. That's the same thing. The result of the work that I'm presenting today is a new library in a grammar engineering system, which allows one to test more complex hypotheses. In addition, I contribute some archived test suites and specific analysis for several languages. I document certain takeaways regarding the analysis that I develop. What is head-driven phrase structure grammar? Head-driven phrase structure grammar, or HPSG, is a fully explicit syntactic formalism, which is to say that it can be implemented on the computer, right? So there are no parts to it which are not sufficiently explicit to be implemented in a machine-readable way. Furthermore, this approach to human language is lexicalist and surface-oriented, which is to say that a lot of the information we assume that it is contained in the lexicon rather than in the phrase structure rules. And in addition, we like to avoid operation and concepts which cannot be easily mapped to the surface string, which makes HPSG an excellent choice for computational linguistics, for anything that you like to do on the computer. Just a few other things to say about HPSG here. Any grammar in HPSG is a hierarchy of types, and the types are encoded as feature structures, where features are constrained to have specific values. And any structure that actually licenses a sentence, that admits a sentence as grammatical, must conform to the well-formedness constraints, however they are defined. So in this picture, you just see a simple, tiny hierarchy of a few phrase structure rules. Any phrase structure rule is a feature structure which has certain constraints. For example, this feature structure is saying essentially, and it's easier, I think, to demonstrate on the next slide, this feature structure is saying essentially that the subject of this clause was already found, it was already attached to the verb, and furthermore, it was attached here on the left as the left daughter, and furthermore, this left daughter is not the head. It is called the non-head daughter, while the head daughter role is taken by the verb itself. So that's what this phrase structure rule is saying. And in HPSG, we have different tracks of research that have been coexisting for many years now. There is a purely theoretical branch of HPSG, and there are several actually branches of computational research, and I represent one of them. And that research community is called Delfen. It stands for Deep Linguistic Processing with HPSG Initiative. And it's an international consortium, and we use a particular restricted version of HPSG formalism, which was optimized for faster parsing, for example. I'm going to briefly introduce a few main projects produced by the Delfen community. The most famous one probably, and certainly the biggest one, is the English Resource Grammar, or the ERG. It is a broad coverage grammar of English, which is used actually in NLP occasionally, and it is actually used all the time for evaluating semantic parsers, because the beauty of the ERG is that it can produce semantic representations like these ones. This is just a sample dependency graph, which was compositionally produced off of a syntactic tree, which was in turn automatically produced by the ERG. And this is a very robust and systematic way of obtaining dependency graphs for sentences. And as a target semantic representation, this is in fact quite popular today. And I am giving you a couple of citations here if you're curious, which I think this particular one, Open and Flickinger 2019, summarizes a few statistics about how these semantic representations are used in SemEval. There are also smaller grammars which still have relatively decent coverage, including grammars of Japanese, Chinese, German, Spanish, and a few other languages. And finally, another product of Delfen that I wanted to mention, but I will mostly be talking about it in part 3 of my talk, is the grammar matrix. The grammar matrix is the framework for automated starter grammars, which are which is also a typologically driven framework and setting. More about this later. And now I will just summarize what I did in my dissertation in this Delfen HPSG framework, and that is an analysis of constituent questions. And I will start from just saying that this is, of course, a classic topic in syntactic theory, which concerns itself with questions like how are question words distributed in languages, how do we represent interrogative semantics, how do we compute interrogative semantics off of the syntax tree, for instance, and there are some pretty intricate questions there which have to do with how to link the appropriate WH word, question word, with the right event. in the sentence, because when you have complex sentences, then it actually is not trivial to understand systematically how to link a question word to the right event. There are, of course, big questions in syntax on how to model question word fronting, such as in this example 4 here, and how to model optional fronting, such as in example 5 here. These are examples from Russian, and you can see that in Russian, multiple WH words can be fronted, for instance, which is one phenomenon. And then furthermore, a WH word may appear what looks like, it looks like it's sort of in between the subject and the verb, so not fronted. These are just some examples of the phenomena which require syntactic analysis. And in HPSG, previously, there was not an analysis of multiple fronting, for example, and there was not a unified HPSG account in typologically different languages, which is what I present in my dissertation, and the citation here did not really come out the way it should have come out, but here it is. That's my dissertation here. So basically, the goal is to be able to go from a sentence like this one, right? And there is a wide range of what a WH question might look like in Russian, for example. So to go from a sentence that is a WH question through a syntactic structure to a semantic structure, which is represented here as a dependency graph. So this is what we want. Now, how is that achieved in HPSG? There is a classic analysis of WH fronting by Ginsburg and Sag back from 2000. And that has to do with so-called non-local features. So remember, in HPSG, everything is features constrained to have some values. Well, we can have a feature called slash here. We can have a feature which records that there is a long-distance dependency between the verb and its subject. And then we can use that feature, we can propagate it up the tree, and then we can, so this is the way that we can ultimately license a fronted subject, because we recorded the information that, okay, we don't have the subject in its normal position, but we still are looking for a subject, and then eventually a subject will be licensed in an appropriate position using the slash feature rather than the subj feature as would be the normal case. So that's the classic analysis. And what I do in my dissertation, in particular, one of the things I do is I say, okay, well, in order to do multiple fronting, then we can do multiple elements on the slash list. So we don't have to have just one element on the slash list. They can be multiple. And then we can do recursive application of the phrase structure rule, which is responsible for filling those gaps. So slashes are also often called gaps because they kind of represent a missing object, an object that is missing from its normal position in the sentence. So the phrase structure rule, which is responsible for filling the gaps, I implement a recursive version of it. Okay, and this way we achieve the analysis that we want for this kind of WH question structure. I'm not going to say much more about this, and I'm not going to get much more technical than this, but I'm going to mention that there are some interesting takeaways from this process, because this looks simple on the conceptual level, but actually implementing it and testing it in a larger test suite of Russian, for instance, where different syntactic patterns are featured, actually led me to some interesting takeaways and questions. And in particular, remember I showed you an example where the fronting appeared optional. This is the same language, right? So I need to be able to model 4 and 5 at the same time. And it turns out it's actually hard to do. It leads to spurious ambiguity if we try to model 4 and 5 together, or phenomena that look like 4 and 5 in the same grammar. Furthermore, there were some interesting tensions that I identified across grammars, because Russian was not the only language I was working with. And I will talk a little bit more about this in part 3 of my talk. There are quite a few open questions, starting with what is the optimal way of modeling optional fronting such that it doesn't lead to problems in my grammars. And I think that the direction to go there is something that you might be familiar with, the notion of information structure. The information structure is this study of what information is new in a sentence, what information is assumed in a sentence, and there is a body of literature in syntax which looks at constituent questions from the information structural perspective, but nobody has so far implemented that in HPSG. So that is an open direction to try. And then there are all sorts of interesting big questions which appear from there, because you might at this point say, well, but then isn't the problem with Delfen HPSG then, rather than with HPSG in general or syntactic theory in general, the fact that you were not able to, that you got this spurious ambiguity when you tried to implement those two phenomena together. And, you know, maybe some of it will be incidental to the specific formalism that we use, but other things probably will not be, and will have to do with the complexity of natural language itself rather than the complexity of the specific framework that is being used. And as for the tension between morphologically rich languages and languages which do fronting, sorry, not morphologically rich, languages which use morphological marking for marking constituent questions, and languages which use fronting to build constituent questions. As I hinted, I identified tensions between the analyses if I try to put them in the same system. And as for that question, that has, of course, to do with this really big question of whether we even want to be able to put all analyses for all languages into one framework, and to what degree must a system be elegant, and what is more important, the elegance or the coverage of a particular system. And these are really big questions, and it's kind of exciting to stumble upon more examples of how they are relevant in computational linguistics. And stay tuned for part 3 of my talk, which will have to do with assembling typologically diverse analyses and evaluating the result. And I will try to make part 3 a little bit shorter to compensate for the overtime which I admitted in this portion. Thank you.